For 120 years, one man built a boat on dry land while the whole world laughed at him. Neighbors walked by every single day and watched him hammer wood under a clear blue sky. No rain, no flood, no reason. Everyone thought he was insane, but here comes the part nobody tells you. The door of that ark held a secret that would change how you see your own faith. Stay with us, we're going to unveil it together, and by the end, you'll never read this story the same way again. Before we get to the door, we need to understand just how dark the world had become. Genesis tells us the earth was corrupt in God's sight. The earth was filled with violence. Genesis 6:11. Every inclination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. Not evil sometimes, not evil in certain seasons, only evil continually, every single day. Scholars and rabbis have debated for centuries exactly how deep that corruption went, but on one thing the text is crystal clear: it grieved God. Genesis 6 says, "The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." Can you imagine that? The creator of the universe, looking at what his creation had become and feeling grief in his heart. But in the middle of that darkness, one name shines through. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8, and the next verse tells us why. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Genesis 6:9. In a world drowning in wickedness, one man kept walking in the opposite direction, and that decision was about to cost him everything he had, at least in the eyes of everyone watching him. So God gave him instructions that must have sounded impossible. Build an ark of gopher wood, cover it inside and out with pitch. Genesis 6:14, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. That's longer than a football field, brother, and taller than a 4-story building. And Noah had never seen rain fall from the sky, not once in his entire life. There was no such thing as rain yet. The earth was watered by a mist that rose from the ground. Genesis 2:6. So try to picture the mockery. A man building a massive sea vessel, miles from any ocean, in a world that had never once seen a drop fall from the clouds, to prepare for something that had never happened in the history of the world. For over a century, Noah preached righteousness while he built. 2 Peter 2:5 calls him a preacher of righteousness. And for over a century, almost nobody listened. Not one person outside his own household believed him. Think about what that actually means. Generation after generation was born, grew old, and died while Noah kept hammering. Children who mocked him as boys grew into old men who still mocked him. Can you imagine the loneliness? Waking up every single day to ridicule. Working with your hands on something the entire world calls madness. Watching your own neighbors shake their heads and walk away. And still showing up the next morning to keep building. Because the voice that gave the instructions hadn't changed his mind. Finally, after 120 years, the ark was finished. And God gave Noah one final, strange instruction. Make a door in the side of the ark. Genesis 6:16. Not 2 doors, not several entrances placed conveniently around the hull for the sake of efficiency. 1 door. On a vessel meant to carry 8 people and representatives of every kind of land animal on Earth through the greatest catastrophe the world had ever seen, there was exactly one way in. Think about that for a second. God could have designed any number of entrances. He didn't. He designed one. And every single living thing that survived the flood, every human being, every bird, every creeping thing, every animal, walked through that same single opening. There was no other way onto that ark. There was no side door reserved for the important people, and a back door for everyone else. One door for everyone, regardless of who they were. The animals came on their own. Genesis 7:9 says they came to Noah, 2 and 2, male and female. Nobody had to hunt them down. Nobody had to chase a lion across a field or wrestle an elephant up a ramp. They simply came, gathered by a force greater than instinct, and walked through that one door. 7 pairs of every clean animal, 1 pair of every unclean one, according to God's own instructions in Genesis 7:2. Imagine standing at that doorway and watching creation itself file past you in obedient order, as if every living thing somehow understood what was coming, even though the sky above them was still perfectly clear. And here's the detail that almost nobody preaches on. Genesis 7:16 says something so easy to skip right past that most readers never even pause on it. The animals went in, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And then it says, "And the Lord shut him in." Read that again slowly. It doesn't say Noah shut the door behind him. It doesn't say Noah, satisfied that everyone was aboard, pulled the door closed and secured the latch. It says the Lord shut him in. Noah built the ark with his own hands for 120 years. He gathered the supplies. He preached to a generation that refused to hear him. He loaded his family and thousands of animals into that vessel exactly as instructed. But when the moment of judgment finally arrived, he did not seal his own fate. God did. The same hand that was about to flood the earth was the hand that closed that one door and secured everyone inside from the wrath that was about to fall outside. That's the secret hidden inside this story. Salvation was never something Noah could finish on his own. He could build, he could obey, he could preach, he could walk through the door God provided, but he could not lock himself in. Only God could do that final, decisive act. And once that door was shut by the hand of the Lord, it was shut completely. Genesis 7:11 tells us that on that very day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis 7:12. The waters rose so high that every high hill under the whole heaven was covered. Genesis 7:19. 15 cubits upward the waters prevailed, and the mountains were covered. Genesis 7:20. Try to sit with that image for a moment. Everything outside that one sealed door, gone. Every person who had mocked Noah for a century, every home, every field he had once walked past on his way to gather more wood, all of it disappearing beneath water that kept climbing until there was nothing left to see but sky and sea. And inside, in the darkness of that wooden hull, 8 people and thousands of animals rode out the judgment of the entire world, protected by a door they had not sealed themselves. What must it have been like inside during those 40 days? No windows to the outside world except for one small opening near the roof. Genesis 6:16 again. No way to check how high the water had risen or how far they had drifted. Just the sound of rain hammering the roof, the groan of timber shifting in the waves, and the quiet, terrifying trust that the door sealed by God's own hand would hold. Noah's faith wasn't tested by the building of the ark. It was tested in that darkness, floating on judgment, with absolutely no control left in his hands at all. The rain eventually stopped, but the waters took months to recede. Genesis 8:3 tells us the water receded steadily, and it wasn't until the 7th month that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Even then, Noah waited. He sent out a raven, and it flew back and forth until the ground had dried. Genesis 8:7. Then he sent a dove, and it found no place to rest, and returned to him. Genesis 8:9. 7 days later, he sent it out again, and this time it came back in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. Genesis 8:11. One green leaf after months of nothing but gray water in every direction, and Noah knew the earth was healing. When Noah finally stepped out onto dry ground, the first thing he did was not celebrate. He built an altar and offered a sacrifice to the Lord. Genesis 8:20. And God responded with a promise, sealed in the sky. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Genesis 9:13. The very sky that had once opened to destroy the world now carried a symbol of mercy across it. Centuries later, Jesus stood in front of a crowd and said something that should stop you in your tracks if you know this story. "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." John 10:9. Not a door, the door. One way in, just like the ark. And the Apostle Peter takes it even further. 1 Peter 3:20 and 21 says that in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes the salvation that now saves you also. Peter looked back at that flood and saw a preview of exactly what we're talking about tonight. Just like Noah, we don't get to seal ourselves in by our own strength. We can walk through the door, we can obey, we can build, we can prepare our whole lives, but it's God's hand, not ours, that secures us once we're inside. So here's what this means for you today. Maybe you feel like you've been building something for years with absolutely nothing to show for it. Maybe the people around you think your faith is foolish, that you're wasting your time preparing for something they can't see coming and don't believe ever will. Noah felt that for over a century. He buried friends. He watched entire generations mock him and die without ever picking up a hammer to help. But the door was still standing on the day the rain finally fell. And once he walked through it, God himself shut him in, safe, before the storm even started. Maybe you also feel like you're in the waiting part of the story right now. The door is shut, the rain is falling, and you can't see land anywhere. If that's you, remember that Noah couldn't see land either. For months, he had nothing but water in every direction and a single small window near the roof, and still, the ark was moving toward dry ground the entire time, even when it felt like it was only drifting. Your waiting season is not proof that God has forgotten the promise. It's the space between the door closing and the mountain appearing. You don't have to secure your own salvation. You just have to walk through the door while it's still open. Because one day, just like with Noah, that door is going to close. And when it does, it won't be your hand on the latch. If this story moved you, leave the like before you go. It genuinely helps this reach someone else who needs to hear it today. And remember Noah, the next time your faith feels lonely, or your obedience feels pointless, or your waiting feels endless. God saw one righteous man in a world that had completely lost its way, and he didn't just save him. He shut the door with his own hand, carried him through the judgment of the whole earth, and brought him safely to dry ground on the other side.